Welcome to EV Hub Live, a live video podcast for professionals advancing transportation electrification. To find out more about the show, visit atlasevhub.com/live. On today's episode, we hear from Stephanie Lotshaw from TransitCenter and Mike Salisbury from the City and County of Denver as they discuss the car-free EV revolution. They'll cover alternative electric transportation and mobility options, the challenges these alternatives are facing, and how U.S. cities are planning for public transit and infrastructure that facilitates all kinds of electric vehicles. Here's your host, Atlas Public Policy's founder, Nick Nigro.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of EV Hub Live. I'm your host, Nick Nigro, and I'm very excited to be talking about something that's near and dear to my heart. Anybody who knows me knows that my primary form of transportation is my bike, and that's how I get around DC most of the time. And sometimes I'll take transit too, which I did this morning. Very rarely do I drive my beloved EV. And so today we're focused on transit and e-bikes and bicycles. And I'm joined by two fabulous guests, Stephanie and Mike, and we're going to get to them in just a second. Before we do, I thought I'd give a little context on where this thought for this show was coming from. Here in DC, our metro system, which was one of the largest in the country and frankly has been really offering great service in the last year or so, is struggling mightily coming back from COVID. Ridership is still down considerably from the levels before the pandemic. And that has led to a considerable shortfall for next year's budget, totaling around $750 million, which is a pretty scary number. It's what's more scary from my point of view is how much that number is up from just last year. Last year, the Metro Agency estimated the shortfall will be somewhere closer to $185 million. And that huge gap is likely explained by the lack of folks taking transit relative to what was expected. And so we've got this issue. We obviously need transit in our cities to thrive, but with the increasing amount of folks working from home and working in hybrid work environments, we're just not getting as much ridership as we expected. It's also led to a considerable amount of office vacancy, again, relative to the pre-pandemic levels. Some places like in Houston, you can see in this graphic here, have very high office vacancies. That might be more explained by an overbuild in their case, but in other cases, like in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and New York, you've got higher office vacancies relative to the pre-pandemic levels, and that's hurting transit as well. And so we're faced with this challenge. We clearly need to solve it, not just for our own well-being in our cities, but also for the climate and for our health. And so I'm going to turn right to Stephanie right now to kick us off and give us a sense of how we should be looking at this data. What's the state of play?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is a very difficult situation that transit is facing right now. I think that, there's a lot of history there to think about, how transit is funded in this country, how we support it, the over reliance on fare revenue as a source of operating revenue. But I mean, what you said is true, right? The people are not riding transit in the way that they had been, right? Because our transit systems have been planned for 9 to 5 commuters. And when that 9 to 5 commuters are going away, obviously there's an issue. And I think a lot of transit agencies have been, including WMATA, have been doing a great job at redoing their schedules, thinking about link trips, thinking about, not orienting around 9 to 5. But obviously with an operating, with the shortfall that you mentioned, right? Like it's not just like a solution centered around like reorienting service to provide for a greater diversity of trips isn't going to get us to where we need to go in the short term. And I think that, for TransitCenter, as we think about it, it really is needing to reconceptualize the role of public transit or the role of, really shared mobility services, in our society, right? Even if you don't ride, I don't ride, somebody else doesn't ride, it doesn't mean that it's not a needed service, right? We depend, all of us depend on people and services that depend on transit, that use transit every day, that can't work from home. And we need to provide for those, for the amount of service that those people need to have our society function. So I think, we're in an interesting conundrum as a society. I think COVID obviously laid this bare, as in addition to a myriad of public services. But I think we're in a moment right now where we have an opportunity to think about, from a transportation perspective, like how do we create communities, cities, and regions that have a certain amount of mobility freedom, that can pick up different kinds of options, and get them to where they need to go, and how do we actually fund those services that they're used for, so that they're useful to people, and that they actually think it's an option, because and for a lot of non-car mobility right now, especially in the US, people don't have many options, and they can't say, oh, I'm going to pick up a bike share, I'm going to pick up a bike, I'm going to ride safely on a street, I'm going to walk. And it's this moment right now, and especially with public transit, as we really look at a potential intense cliff and some of the dissolution of some of these public services, to rethink how we fund transportation, and especially in this moment, how we fund and support a transportation system, a broad transportation system that can meet like our climate goals, that can really address wealth and income inequality in our cities and regions. And so, I guess I see these like specific incidents where X agency or Y agency is experiencing a shortfall as an opportunity to really, rethink our transportation system and how we fund it, how we provide the services within it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more in the sense that this challenge that we're facing right now is really an opportunity. It's looking at what would happen here in the Washington, D.C. metro region if WMATA had to make the cuts that were necessary to balance their budget. It would be absolutely devastating, and nobody wants to do that. And so we have to figure out solutions. And I'd like to bring Mike into the conversation too, because over in Denver, they have a fabulous solution that's been working really well with regards to e-bikes. And I'd love for you to be able to share a little bit more, Mike, about the program that you're running there and how it's working.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Really excited to be part of this, discussion today. We've been really excited over the last year and a half. The city of Denver has been offering e-bike voucher for residents to go out and purchase e-bikes. We have two different levels of voucher. There's a standard voucher up to $300 that anyone can access. Then we have an income qualified voucher up to $1,200 for lower income Denver residents. And they apply online to get the voucher, and then they take that voucher into one of our about 35 participating bike shops, and it comes right off the purchase price. So they're not having to wait for the city of Denver to mail them a check 3 to 4, 6 to 8 weeks later. So it's an upfront purchase, which makes a big difference in people being able to walk out of the bike shops with an e-bike. And so we've been really just, I think, blown away by the interest that people have had in this program. We've, given out over 7,000 e-bikes through the program over the last year and a half. And we're seeing some really great, vehicle miles traveled reduction numbers. On average, people are replacing about over 20 miles a week of vehicle travel. So we think it's coming out as a great way to as one of the tools in our toolbox as a city to get people out of cars and using more sustainable transportation options.
7,000 in 1 year? That's the number?
A year and a half.
Okay.
So we launched in April of 2022, and I guess
incredible.
It's over a year and a half now.
And that's just it's just an astounding figure, I think, for people to wrap their heads around. That many e-bikes getting deployed. Who's funding that? How are you funding that?
So we're very fortunate as a city. Back in 2020, Denver residents passed what is now called the Climate Protection Fund. And that is a sales tax measure that devotes about $40 million a year to the city's climate work. And so the e-bike voucher program is funded through that measure. And so that's allowed us to, make that really large investment in this type of program.
And just one more quick follow-up on that, and it's regards to the choice that you all made to encourage the personal ownership of e-bikes and funding all of that. If you could pull up, John, the other graphic we have on bike share programs, I see a lot of people, including myself, operating our own personal bikes, but there's also vibrant bike share out there, and a large share of them are e-bike friendly across the country. This is some data that DOE just recently shared on their website from a 2022 study. And, you can see that there is a good share of folks doing e-bikes. So I'm wondering to what extent what was the thinking from Denver side on pushing hard on the personal ownership there?
Yeah, well, I think it's all part of an ecosystem of choices. So we have shared micromobility programs in Denver. We had those before our program launched, and we see them. They're kind of serving different use cases. I don't think we've seen at the time we've helped put all these e-bikes on the streets of Denver. We've seen the shared micromobility programs continue to increase ridership and usage. So we don't necessarily see those as being competing. I think they're different use cases. I think, for myself, when I'm downtown Denver, I might just take a scooter or an e-bike for that 1 or 2 mile trip across downtown. That big commute trip, the commute trip, I use my e-bike. So I think they're all parts of how do we give people more kind of sustainable transportation options. Obviously, transit's a huge part of that. That's the backbone of any kind of sustainable transportation system. But how do we make people or give people more options so they it's not just I have to drive my car, no, let's make a great transit system, let's make a great shared micromobility system, and let's give people access to other ways to get around.
Stephanie, when we think about the issues that transit systems are facing right now, the funding shortfalls, the opportunities you bring out, where it's putting the choice now in the hands of the public to decide how they want to fund these things. How important are these bike share programs, e-bike rebate type programs, and other methods to help get people out of their cars in terms of connecting to this case you're trying to make for transit?
Yeah, I think it's just as Mike said, it's about creating a suite of options for people to choose from in order to make, to basically get them out of their cars. I think in the United States, it's just we have a land use system that is so dependent, and that necessitates people to take their cars everywhere. And there are places where, biking and walking are better options than transit. And I think that, for us to create a real system, with options that gives that enables people to say, I don't want to have a car, or I'm only using my car for out of town trips, for example. We have to have a plethora of options for people. I think bike share systems in cities for short trips are fantastic. I live in New York City. And there are times where, I'm walking my kids to school. There are times where I'm, putting them on the e-bike and taking them to school. And then there are times where we're on transit. And I think that having all of those tools at our disposal, just makes the system more robust, makes investments into the system, more of a robust argument, more needed. And I think that I like thinking about it actually as a system, right? Not as we fund transit, we fund biking, we fund more walking facilities. It really is. It's a suite, and we need to think of it like that, right? In order for it actually to function as such, and for people to get out of their cars and see it as an option.
Mike, I'd love to hear your perspective too on this a little bit more on when it comes to the systems level thinking. You mentioned that the use of your bike share systems have increased recently. What about transit? Where are you all with the bus system in light rail that's operating in Denver?
It's a good system. I think it's like any other transit system. It's had a lot of challenges, like just saying things you're outlining earlier. Post-COVID, ridership is still not where it was. It's not recovered to my knowledge, and so that just creates cascading challenges. So at the state level, I know in Colorado, we're trying to think of what are different solutions for that. We've had a couple different models where the states supported fare-free transit in the summertime, kind of during that high bad ozone season, to try to encourage more ridership. And, hopefully
What were the results of that?
They definitely saw, over year, they saw increases in ridership. And I think, that's, I'm not a super huge expert on it, but I think they have seen those, some of those riders stayed. So giving people the option to try it out for free, and that's going to hopefully create some new riders. But I think that, we just have challenges with, needing better headways, better service levels. And a lot of that comes back to having funding in the system, which is a challenge that Stephanie was obviously referring to.
Yeah, we tried to do fare-free buses here in DC. The council enacted it and said it was going to happen, and then it hasn't been funded, and so we're stuck. With Stephanie, is that going to be part of the solution set? Is just buses should be free? And you mentioned earlier this idea of the funding mechanisms being covered by the fares. Transit from a fare box recovery ratio for buses is incredibly low. So should they just be free?
Well, I mean, I think it's a more complicated answer than just should they be free or not, because it still costs money to operate. I mean, I think that's what we're during COVID, right? The operating costs of agencies didn't go down just because people weren't riding, and so we're in this place where they ran deficits because they weren't making the money back. So I think it's I like to rethink, should they be free? But it's really what service do we need to make this, comprehensive transportation system where people have options and people can make different kinds of choices? And how do we fund that? And, what value does it provide to society, right? Are our goals as a society to, reduce VMT and reduce greenhouse gas emissions so we can live in a healthier planet with cleaner air, or not? And so how do we fund systems that actually enable us to do that or not? And I think that, again, the model that we have now, which, really is derivative of the origins of public transit, which was private operations. And the government, when those private operations became less business financially viable, the government took them over, but still maintained this public-private user fee kind of situation. It's where we are now. It's led us to where we are now, which is we have a publicly run system that kind of operates on a heavy user fee model. Obviously, there's with the incredible shock to the system that COVID resulted in. I think we really need to say what is important to invest in as a society that makes that addresses the things that we need, that we want and need it to address, and then let's commit to funding that, right? And it's the same thing with schools and libraries and fire departments and police departments, right? It's if we need these public services, these essential public services, we need to fund them in a way that mitigates them from the shock, right? Because people are well, the service is bad, so I'm not going to use it, but it's bad because we don't fund it. So it's this chicken and an egg, that round and round situation where it's not going to get better if people don't. If we rely on a model where it's dependent on if people ride it, then it gets better. So, yeah.
Yeah, when you were speaking there, I was thinking about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, the reauthorization of transportation here in the federal program. A large share of that funding is not from users. It's user fees and gas taxes and such. It's from other sources.
Right.
And the Congress made the case that that is what's necessary for the infrastructure. A good chunk of that money is going to go to transit systems and trains like Amtrak and such. But, obviously the vast majority is going to support, car-centric travel and vehicle-centric personal ownership system that we have. And so it's funny that you bring up the user pay concept. That was how a vast majority of the funds used to come in for highways as well. But we diverged from that decades ago. And for some reason, there seems to be this lingering need, but transit should be paying for it in a different way.
Well, and I would even say the same thing is true for bike share systems, right? They rely on a user fee model. And I think we're seeing the challenges of that, right? These systems have expenses, and those expenses exist kind of regardless actually of the whether people are using it or not. And so it's about like, what value is this to society? What kind of service does it provide? And how do we invest in it so that actually it is used? Because people won't use broken systems.
Yeah, Mike, let's bring you into that and talk about a little bit about how things are working in Denver, because you do have the program that you said for the rebate program for the e-bikes, but then you don't intend that to conflict with the bike share program. So how are you dealing with the funding and maintenance of that program there?
Yeah, in the city of Denver for our shared micromobility program, so we're working with Lyft and Lime, and so it's actually not something that the city is directly funding. Lyft and Lime is able to come in, make use of the city's right-of-way as where they're deploying these e-bikes and scooters, and then they are, operating the service at no cost to the city. So it's really, we have a lot of different other elements in that. We're really trying to focus as a city, like how do we, we have them different programs to encourage the deployment in kind of different under-resourced communities. So, all the rides aren't just, all the bikes and scooters aren't just focused on, say, the central business district. So, making sure that, across the city of Denver, people have access and affordable access to the shared micromobility options. Because at the end of the day, it's not, there's a lot of, going back to use cases, like there's people who, even with a rebate might not be able to afford an e-bike, or they might not be able to store an e-bike in their third floor walk-up apartment, or they might not have a secure place to store their e-bike when they go into their job. And so I just
or to charge it.
Right. So there's lots of places where the individual e-bike ownership model just doesn't make sense for people. And so we think we're not in a world where, we've saturated the market. Even with 7,000 e-bikes, we have not saturated the market. And we just think there's a lot of potential for the complementary nature of the programs. Like some people, it's going to work a lot better to like rent the bike for an hour and not have to deal with it after that. And for some people, that individual ownership model is going to work really well.
I want to bring this back to climate. We work on climate issues at Atlas often through solutions like electric vehicles. We're focused here today on e-bikes and transit in part because this is the solution for the leg of the stool that unfortunately has gotten the least love in the last several years, and that's the reduction in vehicle miles traveled, VMT. We do a lot on vehicle efficiency in this country. We do a lot on low carbon fuels, read EVs in this country. We don't do enough on VMT. And so we wanted to make sure that we were giving the attention to it that it deserves. And so I'd love to hear, Stephanie, from your side about how important is VMT reduction when it comes to thinking about this as a climate solution, not just something for the well-being of our cities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's essential. I mean, I think there are lots of ways to quantify like why shifting people out of cars is important for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Just getting people out of cars for one. The efficiency of public buses, but I also think as we are moving towards a renewable energy future, a clean energy future, like we also have to think about consumption and demand in that time frame. And VMT reduction is an important way to reduce demand, so that as we transition other sectors, industry, et cetera, we actually have the ability to do so, and we aren't just like shifting emissions into another area, right? Because our grid right now is not clean. It's still fossil fuel based in large measure, and we're trying to change that. And even the capacity of the grid, right? So, I think VMT reduction in the transportation sector, which is, the highest emitting sector right now, it's essential to think of it as like a suite of options, right? We need electrification, but we also need VMT reduction. We need to invest in both of those strategies in order to meet our really ambitious climate goals. And like, in California, for example, they have gone big on EVs, but they're not going to meet their climate targets if they're not also reducing VMT. And that comes with investing in transit, investing in biking and walking facilities, investing in the programs like in Denver.
Yeah, I have a kind of a tough question for you on as a follow-up on this, and that is, I mentioned earlier IIJA, and you've also got IRA funding. A lot of the money that goes into transit is to fund zero emission buses. There's a considerable amount of money going there. I've heard some grumblings from transit advocates that that's not where we should be putting our money right now. We should be putting it towards operating expenses. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of balancing that? I know clearly, the health effects and other issues related to diesel powered buses are real and measurable. And the benefits of electric buses are also real. And should transit advocates be balancing those two potentially competing goals? Because electric buses are expensive. Don't get me wrong, but they're also essential.
Yeah, and the infrastructure, to properly administer and maintain electric buses is also important, and that we're still not 100% there in that regard. But I think it really is a both and, right? We need we do need electric buses. Like the black carbon from heavy duty vehicles is real, and it's severely affecting disadvantaged communities, right, where those depots are located. So the electrification of that fleet is essential. However, having it come at the expense of service is challenging, right? Because we're trying to shift people out of their cars. And if the service isn't there, then they're not going to do that. And also, the agencies and the build out of the infrastructure that allows the electric buses to be, viable options for agencies is not there either. It's going to take time to get there. So to me, it's a both. We have to think about both of these things and set realistic yet ambitious targets for the achievement of it. And we have to put money into those, both of those solutions, which we're not.
Mike, you mentioned at the top that the e-bike program, the rebate program you have is funded through your climate fund. How did you make the case for that? These are bikes. They don't have bicycles. Bicycles have zero emissions when they're not powered by anything. But now you're trying to encourage more people on bikes to get them hopefully out of cars. So tell me about how you made the case for that to get this money out of a climate-oriented fund.
Sure. I think the first thing is when you look at an e-bike is that compared to on a per mile basis, compared to a vehicle, it has essentially like 1% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a huge climate benefit from an e-bike. Now, I think there's definitely, I still have my own acoustic bike. I love it. Still ride it sometimes.
Acoustic. I like that. Okay.
But at the end of the day, we looked at, how could we make the biggest impact? And at the end of the day, e-bikes, I think, open the door to alternative transportation modes in a way that a regular bike just doesn't. The benefits of I can ride 10 miles, show up at my work or at my meeting or at my appointment and not be sweaty, not be in need of a shower necessarily when you finish that trip. And it opens up to people who I think never have thought about riding a bike. We have lots of people I haven't ridden a bike since I was 15 years old, but when I tried the e-bike, I was hooked. Or you have elderly residents who just can't, maybe don't have the physical capabilities to ride a bike long distances anymore. So I think the e-bike opens it up and makes that transportation alternative available and feasible for a much larger universe and for a much larger universe of trips as well. So that's kind of how we were able to make the case that e-bikes really are having a substantial climate impact.
I have to say that is exactly the rationale that I had for myself and why I have an e-bike and how I take it to and from this office here in DC and in how I use it to get around almost everywhere. DC has very extreme climates in that it's very hot here in the summertime and it can get pretty cold here in the wintertime too. And it just was not feasible for me to be able to bike around like that in those conditions. But with an e-bike, it's really not a big deal. And I totally agree. And I think that, this marrying of personal bicycle ownership and bike share with transit is really what is going to be necessary for us to overcome the challenges we've been facing right now with ridership and such. And so I really appreciate both of your perspectives on the show. And that's going to bring us to a conclusion for our first EV Hub Live episode focused on e-bikes in transit. Unlikely to be our last. I look forward to bringing you guys back on the show in 2024 to find out how many more e-bike rebates you were able to give out, Mike, and how Stephanie, your great organization, has single-handedly fixed all the transit funding problems.
Oh yes, I'll be sure to update you in a month. It'll be fixed.
There you go. Okay, great. Thanks again to both of you for joining us, and that's a wrap for us at EV Hub Live. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon. Bye.